So put your hands together and give a warm welcome to Brian.
Thank you. Thank you. I almost set my coffee on. Thanks for having me up here. I'm learning a lot. Hopefully I teach you a thing or two too. I'm not sure. Thanks for the introduction. Before I became executive director at the Center for Rural Affairs, I was our policy director, and before that I was the organizing director. So I spent 6 or 7 years really immersed in our policy work, so it's close to my heart. Again, briefly, this is where we work. Our main office is in Nebraska, and the majority of our staff are in Nebraska, the red state in the middle there. We also have staff in Montana and Iowa and offices there. Those are recent additions in the last 5 years, and as I mentioned yesterday, those are policy staff. And so we can have a bigger footprint for our policy advocacy work. The states in orange are states where we regularly do policy organizing on the ground. We regularly hold grassroots meetings, and I call it our base state regions, the states that we're strongest in. And then we've got friends and allies all over the country. And really a key reason for the founding of the center, when our 2 co-founders started the organization, was so they could do this policy work, and they could do it all across the state, and they could do it all across the nation, which was not the mandate of the organization that they were working for before. Let's start here. I asked you questions yesterday, I'll ask you questions again today. Why work on policy? I know I'm supposed to answer that, but what do you think?
Make change upstream.
Make change upstream. Good. What else?
Enable programs.
Enable programs. Very good.
Get red tape out of the way.
Get red tape out of the way. Any others?
Because if you don't do it, it'll be done to you.
You don't do it, it'll be done to you. I don't need to give this presentation. You can all come up. Some of the reasons we work on policy, I'll hit on all of these as I go, but I'm going to start by talking about that first one, and maybe it's similar to the, if you don't do it, it'll be done to you. We were first driven to work on policy because we observed that many of the challenges our communities face were the result of existing policy, things being done to you. And we don't think that it's possible to solve those challenges that were created by policy unless you change the policy. And I'll give you an example. In our region, the agricultural sector has declined as farms have consolidated. Of course, that has ripple effects on our small town economies, on our schools, our hospitals, on the whole business sector. Yet, we hold in the US that farm consolidation was not inevitable. It was a phenomenon that we created by virtue of farm policies that favored large farms, and we have actually subsidized in the US large farms at the expense of smaller farms, and we would argue we subsidize large farms to buy out smaller farms. And so there you had a very specific link of how policy was having a corrosive effect on our communities, and we don't think we can reverse that corrosive effect unless we reverse the policy. That's why we work on policy change. I also said yesterday, one of the things that sets the center apart from local organizations, I think I get the sense that a lot of you represent local organizations, is that we do the policy advocacy work. We run a big policy shop. It's about 1/3 of the organization is folks working on policy. And so we're able to leverage those relationships with local community-based organizations and get those community-based organizations engaged in policy. And it's really mutually beneficial with us both serving our individual roles. Touched on this yesterday, our theory of change, and I'm going to go into it a little bit more in depth. But I just think it's important, and this sort of flows out of what I just said, but you have to have leaders working locally. It's critical. But then those leaders have to come together in order to work on common challenges, in this case, policy advocacy, policy change, hopefully winning policy, getting red tape out of the way, what have you, depending on the issue, so that they can do their local efforts better. If you don't work on policy, your local leaders will always be fighting with one arm tied behind their back because they won't have the right policies, the right financing mechanisms, there'll be too much red tape, what have you. I'll give you two examples of that theory of change in action. We, as you know from yesterday, are a small business lender. And we were able to scale that work fairly successfully in Nebraska. But we noticed that others, both in Nebraska who were doing small business lending, and then particularly in other states, there was a real dearth of statewide small business lending capacity, such as we have been able to build in Nebraska. And so we had a situation where local folks who were trying to do small business development were fighting with one hand tied behind their back because they didn't have the right funding mechanisms, they didn't have the right policy behind them to do the small business development work. So we did this twice. First in Nebraska, 15 years ago or more, we organized probably a dozen different small business development groups around the state of Nebraska and worked together, went to our state capital in Lincoln and passed a bill through the state government to provide additional funding through our State Department of Economic Development for small business development. And now today, 15 years later, that program has morphed and that program has expanded. And as a result of our joint advocacy efforts, the state of Nebraska, through the Department of Economic Development, puts $1 million per year into small business development. And all of that money goes to contracts with intermediary organizations like the center and others around the state. So we were able to follow around the circle, right? Band together, advocate for small business policy change, win new resources, plugs back into local leaders being able to do their work more effectively. In 2008, we set out to do this at the federal level to replicate a program that was very similar to what we had won in Nebraska through the Farm Bill, which is our omnibus farm and rural policy bill in the United States, renewed every 5 years. So we wrote a program called the Rural Micro-Entrepreneur Assistance Program. And again, we went out and organized small business lenders like the center, but all across the nation. Coastal Enterprises, who we heard from earlier, were supportive of this program. I'm pretty sure grantees now. I don't see Gray in the room. Anyway, we won the program in the Farm Bill, and we won $15 million in mandatory money in the 2008 Farm Bill for the program. That might not seem like a ton of money, $15 million over 5 years, spread out over the entire United States. But do the math. We spent about $500,000 in private foundation funds that we raised to research, write, and advocate for that program over the course of 3 years. And since then, that program, the Rural Micro-Entrepreneur Assistance Program, that we won, $3.5 million campaign to win, has funded more than 150 different small business development organizations in rural areas all across the United States, not quite, in 42 states. 42 states. And the combined awards since 2008 are $9 million in grant funding to support this work and $42 million in low-interest loan capital to support small business development work. So by pouring, adds up to $50 million, by pouring $500,000 of foundation money into advocacy efforts, we were able to secure what is now $50 million and counting every year, because the program still exists and it's still funded. You do the math, right? That's a pretty good return on investment. 1 to 100, good return on investment, right? We take that. That's why we work on policy, because you can see that level of scale and that return on investment. One of our foundation funders, who actually funded this work in part, is fond of saying, we, the foundation in that case, have a small pot of money, a relatively small pot of money, and government has a big pot of money. So we're going to use our small pot of money at the foundation to try to move government's big pot of money. The foundation, if they wanted to, could just fund the small business development work themselves, but they wouldn't get this return on investment of $500,000 in advocacy efforts, turning into $50 million in small business support. I didn't know what order to do this presentation in. So, in case you've been lost so far and you wonder what I mean when I say policy advocacy, I'll walk you through our approach. We start with analysis of the need, challenge, or opportunity. All of our major policy initiatives have been grounded in research and analysis of a particular issue. Here again, being rooted in a rural place, our office is in a town of 850 people in northeast Nebraska, is instrumental to our understanding of the landscape, being able to identify the right issues to work on, and being able to identify the right solutions to those. We're solutions focused in our policy advocacy. We're always looking for pragmatic and practical policy ideas that we think we can actually win in DC or in Lincoln. So solutions oriented and pragmatic. This is probably the most important part, and often where we spend most of our effort. It's organizing, 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 getting grassroots folks to meetings, making phone calls, traveling with advocates to talk to policymakers. And related to this, we also spend a lot of time on coalition building and engaging in networks as part of the organizing. I think it's important to stick with this work over a long period of time. It allows you to foster relationships. That includes fostering relationships with policymakers, but also fostering relationships with allies, and it makes you more successful. If you do policy advocacy and it's sort of one-off, or you don't stick at it long enough and you're frustrated, I would encourage you not to abandon it too quickly. It can take a while. Finally, we like to win, but we know that winning is usually only half the battle, sometimes less than half the battle. And we have to stay engaged, and we stay very hands-on through the implementation phase, harkening back to that Rural Micro-Entrepreneur Assistance Program, the program we won in the 2008 Farm Bill. We are still engaged with USDA to this day on getting that program implemented well. They have an amazing ability to screw up our intentions in the legislative language. And so it takes years of hands-on implementation work in order to get the job done. Here's some pictures. Policy advocacy in action. The first one there is Justin Dorr. He is a veteran and beginning farmer from South Dakota, and he's testifying before a congressional panel there. We had worked with him actually on the direct service side of our organization, which is a nice interplay. We can bring people in who come to work with us originally on a business plan or because they need help navigating federal farm programs. And then later, we can say, tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, would you like to go to Washington and testify on this issue that we know is important to you? In the other corner is one of our grassroots supporters from Wisconsin with our president after a panel on rural youth he was lucky enough to be invited to in Washington. The first picture is two of our board members in Washington. We have a constituent board. Our board is farmers and ranchers and small business owners and community leaders. One of the big advantages of having a constituent board is you have really powerful voices that you can readily engage in policy advocacy, very authentic voices. They were in DC to, as part of a fly-in on commodity program reform in the most recent Farm Bill, 2013 Farm Bill. And then the other picture is Greg in the cowboy hat, one of our staff, Tracy, sitting on the same side of the table with him, and they are talking to Greg's senator, Heidi Heitkamp, from North Dakota. There's two of our staff with Congressman Fortenberry from Nebraska. Another reason we think it's important to work on policy issues is to combat the often monolithic view of rural places. Where we work, this manifests itself in a notion that farm policy equals rural policy. Here, perhaps, it manifests itself in a notion that forestry policy is equal to rural policy. And of course, if you spend any time in these communities, you know a whole host of things: energy, water, healthcare, education. All of these things are incredibly important to our communities, and often one-size-fits-all solutions on those fronts don't serve us well, but yet policymakers somehow think that if they have a proposal for a new crop insurance program, that they've done everything they need to do to shore up their base in rural Nebraska. Another one we see frequently is the notion that rural voters are universally conservative. These perceptions aren't true, and they're not helpful in the policymaking process. And really the only way to combat them is to do this, is to put real rural people in front of the policymakers and have them tell the policymakers, no, your proposal on crop insurance isn't all you need to do for North Dakota. All right, Gordon asked me to touch on a few questions that I haven't hit on yet. One was, does government already have a good sense of rural issues and how to address them? In the US, I would say no. I'll let somebody else answer the question for BC. But in the US, the political and economic power sectors are in the large urban areas. The major media outlets, the leading thinkers, and many politicians all buy into that, that frame I was talking about yesterday, the crisis frame. You often hear them think about rural places, talk about rural places as if they're all backwaters and decline. So that's another reason that it's important to get rural people organized, put them in front of policymakers. Two, can you think of examples where government policies fail to understand rural areas? I would say the primary one from our experience is the Farm Bill in the US. That is the major piece of federal federal rural legislation, yet all non-farm rural development is like shoehorned into this thing that we call the Farm Bill. We have one section called the Rural Development Title, like a 13-section bill that gets this much for resources, well, we pump this much into farm sector policy. And then lastly, what would I recommend to organizations that want to try to influence rural policy? Get organized. Number one recommendation. That can mean forming a coalition, some other sort of organizing body. And then two, prioritize something very specific that you want to change. Too often I see folks who struggle with policy and come together. Everybody has all these grandiose ideas of the things we're going to change in government, and the group fails to prioritize and pick something specific that they can actually write a piece of policy together and go win. So get organized, prioritize, and be pragmatic. I was in Colorado recently. I I was driving on back gravel roads in the eastern plains of Colorado, and I saw these two mailboxes, and I looked down the driveway, and I couldn't see the house. I almost showed this yesterday when I asked what the definition of rural is. we might not all know or agree on what the definition of rural is, but another definition that I like, that I sometimes hear, is you know it when you see it. And I think this fits that bill. And that's all.